Welcome back, ladies and gentlemen. So we are going to continue our discussion of our biogeochemical cycles, and keep in mind that as we move through all of these cycles, we're really focusing on elements that are essential for life as they cycle through those ecosystems. So if we kind of give ourselves a quick refresher of our biochemistry, remember that there are about 25 naturally occurring elements that are found in living things. That being said, about 4 of those elements make up about 96% of our overall body mass, and that includes our carbon, oxygen, nitrogen, and hydrogen. The other 4% are trace elements, things like calcium, phosphorus, potassium, sulfur, sodium, all of which play important roles in our body in order to make them function. They all have to be there. They just don't make up as much of the biomass, if you will, as those carbon, hydrogen, oxygen, nitrogen does. So if you look, some of the nutrient cycles we're going to focus on are going to be a lot of these major elements: the carbon, the oxygen, the nitrogen, the hydrogen and the oxygen work together in the water cycle. And then we're also going to talk a little bit about our phosphorus as well. So today we're going to focus first and foremost on the carbon cycle, and sort of this idea of carbon-oxygen cycle. Again, it can depend on who you talk to, whether they smush those two cycles together, split those two cycles apart, and we're sort of going to talk about them collectively today. So why do we care, right? Why do we want to know where carbon is going and how does it get recycled? Well, because all of our biochemistry, all of our organic chemistry is based on carbon itself, right? This is the essential backbone to all of our macromolecules, our proteins, our fats, our carbohydrates, our nucleic acids. Everything is based on carbon. So we really need to ensure that that carbon is being recycled through our ecosystem. Otherwise, there is no living chemistry. So carbon is going to be cycled both through the atmosphere, through our landforms, through our water, and through our ecosystems, um, including the organisms that live there. And so when we look at the major processes that are part of that carbon cycle, we can actually kind of split it up into sort of a more short-term carbon cycle versus a long-term carbon cycle. So when we look at short-term carbon cycles, this really is the major processes that are going on within living things from sort of a day-to-day or a lifetime to lifetime basis. And so those two major processes are the big ones that we talked about when we talked about cellular metabolism, your photosynthesis and your cellular respiration, right? So those producers are taking in energy from the sun, converting carbon dioxide and water coming out of their environment, from the atmosphere, from groundwater, and converting those carbons, moving them around to create glucose and to create oxygen. So that those plants, those producers, can use that glucose and oxygen for their own cellular respiration processes in order to make ATP so that they have energy to do all sorts of cellular work. Or those producers get eaten by a consumer who then does that cellular respiration process for themselves, utilizing the glucose and the oxygen that the producer provided and make the ATP so that they can do cellular work. And then the consumer gets eaten by another consumer and continues the movement of that glucose and oxygen up through the food chain. By the production of cellular respiration processes happening, whether it's by the plant themselves or the other organisms up that ecosystem's food chain, that carbon dioxide gets recycled back to the atmosphere to be used by those producers again, as well as the water. So atmospheric oxygen is incredibly important. Atmospheric carbon dioxide also important in order to be the carbon sources and the oxygen sources and the hydrogen sources for this particular short-term carbon cycle. Decomposers are also going to play a role here in the short-term carbon cycle as well. They will certainly do their own metabolic processes, things like cellular respiration, and so, but they will be taking those organic materials like glucose and oxygen, not necessarily from another living organism, but from dead organisms as they help to break those guys down. They'll also utilize processes like cellular respiration to make ATP for themselves and then release the carbon dioxide in the water as well. Some other atmospheric carbon in this short-term carbon cycle can also come from methane. Um, Again, another byproduct of some of the decomposer processes that aren't necessarily cellular respiration. So a lot of that methane can come from places where there's a lot of decomposition. Landfills, for example, wetlands actually can be very highly anoxic, and so there's a lot of decomposition, excuse me, that can happen in those places. Livestock, just sort of natural sort of gut bacteria and things that are doing um, decomposition within their own body, breaking down nutrients that the livestock can't do themselves. And so, well, they release some gas, and some of that gas can also be methane as well. Long-term carbon cycle is more on the geologic side of things. So there are areas within our Earth where we store carbon over long periods of time, something called carbon sinks, carbon reservoirs. And just some examples of that are things like carbonates, so hard parts of bone or shell that eventually get compressed under high pressure um, and form things like limestone rocks. In fact, limestone is one of the biggest carbon sinks on Earth. How does that limestone then recycle that carbon back to the rest of the ecosystem? Well, it gets sort of eroded, weathered away, washed away, whether it literally is by water or sort of wind or air processes that happen when that limestone gets exposed to water or the air in the atmosphere. And so that gets broken down and gets recycled by that process back into the water sources, which then can get back to plants to be utilized and taken um, up their roots as a way to utilize some additional carbon. Cellulose in plants actually is another really cool carbon sink. So when those plants go through photosynthesis and they create that glucose, they can certainly use that glucose as a means of going through cellular respiration and producing ATP for themselves. But a lot of plants will also take some of that glucose and use it as a building material. If you are a plant that has a cell wall, which pretty much is all plants, we can then take that cellulose and they will string that glucose, I should say, into long chains and form cellulose as a result. And so they'll store the cellulose in that respect. That carbon that is stored in that cellulose can get re-released to the atmosphere in the form of carbon dioxide, either in the form of combustion, so we burn it, right? Or in the decomposition process when that plant ultimately dies and bacteria come in and break it down. Fossil fuels, all right, oil, petroleum products, methane, propane, all of these fossil fuels that we burn are big, long carbon chains. So they are carbon sinks. They came from decomposing organisms that got sort of compressed and decomposed under high pressures and deep into the earth. Um, and so when we burn those fossil fuels, that carbon dioxide gets released into the air via combustion. The ocean actually is a really huge carbon sink. It's just full of dissolved carbon and dissolved oxygen that is being bubbled out of the atmosphere into the water as that water moves. So it can get dissolved there as well. So when we look at the overall carbon cycle, here's just a way to sort of look at it. Volcanoes, right? Those can also release a lot of carbon in the forms of carbon dioxide, as well as some other chemical gases that can come out of those volcanoes when they erupt. Burning fossil fuels, burning wood as a way to move things around, keep ourselves warm. All of that is going to release carbon dioxide. Cellular respiration will release that carbon dioxide. Decomposition, both on land and in water, will release carbon dioxide to the atmosphere. And so if you look, there's a lot of CO2 release happening. and yet not a lot of being taken back up. Most of that carbon dioxide is taken back up by plants, which is why it's incredibly important to ensure that those plants continue to have a way to exist on this planet. Big forests and things like that are incredibly important to recycle that carbon back out of the atmosphere, and ensure that our overall atmospheric carbon dioxide levels aren't rising to a level that becomes unsustainable for other reasons. And we'll talk a little bit more about that when we get to climate change and things like that. Um, so photosynthesis is going to be the big driver of pulling that carbon dioxide back into the food chains. And so that can be done by plants on land as well as by things like phytoplankton that are hanging out in the oceans. And then that gets moved up the food chain as we move things like glucose and things like that back up through the food chains until we decompose them again, um, or they get released to the atmosphere in the form of carbon dioxide. Again, just another way to look at it. So here are things like the natural gas, the coal, the oil, all those fossil fuels that we use as combustion, the respiration, both from the plants as well as from living things, CO2 that can get dissolved just in the water, as well as being utilized by sort of marine plankton and the plants for photosynthesis. Erosion of some of the rock can also return some carbon back to the ecosystems. There's the limestone example of that. And a lot of that limestone is a result of marine plankton and other marine organisms sort of dying, dissolving in the water, and getting compressed until it gets moved up somewhere else. So let's talk just briefly for now about how humans have affected that carbon cycle. So yearly, somewhere on the order of about 6 billion metric tons of carbon are released into the air in the form of carbon dioxide. Where's it coming from? It's coming from uh, us burning things like wood, deforestation, burning other fossil fuels, the methane, the natural gas, all of that. And about half of what we release remains in the atmosphere. So over the course of the Industrial Revolution, which spiked right here in the late 1800s, early 1900s, so we're talking big factories and cars and steam engines and all these things coming up, that really have allowed us to have this sort of modern way of living, you can see the uptick in CO2 in our atmosphere. And we're not resequestering enough of the CO2 to compensate for what we're putting out there. And so, if you know anything about carbon dioxide, is what we call a greenhouse gas. Greenhouses, right? What do? Well, their job is to take in solar radiation and sort of hold on to it, keep that greenhouse warm, so that we can grow plants and things like that, even in the dead of winter. But when we talk about this on a global scale, we're basically turning up the global temperature because we're not allowing that solar energy to get released back to the atmosphere or back outside of that atmosphere, back out of Earth. Um, so while a certain level of that carbon dioxide is necessary in order to keep global temperatures steady and functional for living things to live here, if we keep turning up the temperature, eventually we're going to sort of create an unsustainable temperature globally, that it's going to mess with weather patterns and distribution of organisms, and we're already starting to see that. We can also lump the oxygen cycle into here, so this is kind of why I said you can kind of sort of overlay, and some textbooks will do that with the oxygen cycle, because mostly the oxygen cycle is this movement of that oxygen through photosynthesis and respiration. So that oxygen being utilized in photosynthesis, being released as a byproduct of that, being important in order for cellular respiration to occur, and then it gets sort of lumped into that carbon dioxide in that water and gets moved through it as well. So it indirectly is transferred both in the carbon cycle here. We'll also see that things like this do play a role in parts of the nitrogen cycle as well as parts of the phosphorus cycle too as we get